Millionaire woman caught in a protest. A street vendor hit her, and what happened next shocked her. The morning of October 15th started like any other for Victoria Sterling. The sleek black Mercedes glided through the streets of downtown Chicago, its tinted windows shielding her from the world she rarely noticed. At 42, Victoria had built an empire from nothing, or so she told herself. Sterling Enterprises now controlled 3 major real estate developments across the Midwest, and her personal worth had recently crossed the $100 million mark. She adjusted her Cartier watch and reviewed the morning schedule on her tablet. A board meeting at 9, lunch with potential investors at the Four Seasons, and a charity gala that evening where she would make a calculated appearance for exactly 90 minutes, long enough to be photographed, brief enough to avoid meaningful conversation with people she considered beneath her station. The Mercedes came to an abrupt halt just blocks from her office building. Through the partition, her driver's voice carried a note of concern she rarely heard from her carefully selected staff. "Mrs. Sterling, there seems to be some kind of demonstration ahead. The police have blocked off Michigan Avenue." Victoria glanced up from her tablet, irritation flickering across her perfectly sculpted features. She had paid over $200 for her morning skincare routine, and her stylist had spent an hour achieving the effortless waves in her auburn hair. She couldn't afford delays, especially not for what she assumed was another pointless gathering of people with too much time and too few responsibilities. "Take the alternate route through the business district," she instructed, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. But as they turned onto State Street, the situation became clear. What had started as a peaceful demonstration about workers' rights had escalated into something far more volatile. The crowd had swelled to thousands, and Victoria could see smoke rising from overturned cars in the distance. The careful choreography of her morning was about to be shattered by forces entirely beyond her control. The Mercedes found itself trapped in a sea of humanity that seemed to pulse with collective anger. Victoria watched through her window as protesters pressed against the vehicle, their faces contorted with passion about issues she had never bothered to understand. Their signs spoke of living wages, healthcare access, and housing affordability concerns that existed in a world so far removed from her penthouse reality that they might as well have been written in a foreign language. When the first brick shattered the rear window, Victoria's carefully constructed sense of invincibility crumbled with the safety glass. Her driver was shouting something about getting out, about the car being a target, but the words seemed to reach her through a fog of disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen to people like her. She had money, influence, connections. She was supposed to be insulated from the chaos that plagued ordinary lives. The door handle felt foreign in her manicured hands as she abandoned the luxury that had defined her existence for the past 2 decades. The moment her $1,000 heels touched the pavement, she was no longer Victoria Sterling, real estate mogul and society fixture. She was simply another person caught in the surge of human emotion that had consumed the streets of Chicago. The crowd moved like a living entity, and Victoria found herself swept along by its current. Her designer purse was torn from her shoulder by invisible hands, taking with it her phone, her identification, and her connection to the world where her name commanded respect and instant service. The carefully applied makeup that had taken her esthetician 45 minutes to perfect was now streaked with tears of panic and confusion. She tried to push against the flow, to find sanctuary in the doorway of a familiar boutique where she had spent thousands of dollars on clothes she wore once before discarding. But the storefront was shuttered, its windows boarded up in anticipation of exactly this kind of civil unrest. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very people whose labor had built her wealth were now an ocean of anger that threatened to drown her. Victoria's lungs burned as she struggled to breathe in the chaos. The crowd's energy was shifting, becoming more volatile with each passing minute. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, but they seemed impossibly far away. Her legs, unaccustomed to anything more strenuous than a leisurely walk from her car to a restaurant entrance, began to tremble with exhaustion. It was then that she felt a firm hand grasp her arm, pulling her with surprising strength toward a narrow alley between two buildings. Her first instinct was to resist, to demand release from this stranger who dared to touch her without permission. But as she looked up into the face of her unexpected rescuer, she saw something that gave her pause. The man was perhaps 50 years old, with weathered hands that spoke of decades of manual labor and kind eyes that seemed to understand her terror without judgment. His clothes were simple but clean, and despite the chaos surrounding them, he moved with the calm confidence of someone who had learned to navigate life's storms without the cushion of wealth and privilege. He guided her deeper into the alley, away from the main thoroughfare where the crowd's anger was reaching a crescendo. The narrow passage was lined with dumpsters and fire escapes, a part of the city's infrastructure that Victoria had never noticed despite walking past it hundreds of times. Here, in this forgotten corner of urban America, she would spend the next several hours discovering truths about herself and her world that would change everything. As they reached a small alcove behind a food truck, Victoria's rescuer turned to face her. For the first time in decades, she found herself truly seeing someone whose existence had been invisible to her despite their proximity. This man, whose name she didn't know and whose story she had never bothered to consider, had just saved her from a situation that her money and influence were powerless to resolve. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In all her years of building wealth and accumulating power, she had never once considered that there might come a moment when those achievements would be meaningless. That moment had arrived, and she was utterly unprepared for it. The alley behind Miguel's food truck had never hosted anyone like Victoria Sterling. For 8 years, this narrow strip of concrete had been Miguel Santos's second home, the place where he served authentic Mexican food to construction workers, taxi drivers, and office employees who couldn't afford the trendy restaurants just blocks away. The irony of sheltering a woman who could buy and sell his entire world wasn't lost on him. But Miguel had learned long ago that kindness didn't require a cost-benefit analysis. Victoria found herself in a space she never knew existed, despite having walked past its entrance countless times. The alley was surprisingly clean, with hand-painted murals covering the brick walls and small potted plants, creating an unexpected oasis of green in the urban landscape. Miguel had created something beautiful in a place that the city's planners had forgotten, using nothing more than determination and care. As the sounds of the protest continued to echo from the main streets, Miguel quietly went about his routine. He offered Victoria a folding chair, the same plastic seat where tired construction workers rested their aching backs during lunch breaks. She accepted it without her usual disdain for anything that wasn't leather and Italian-made, too exhausted and shaken to maintain her customary standards. The hours that followed passed in a strange suspension of time. Victoria watched as Miguel prepared food for the occasional customer who found their way to the alley, seeking refuge from the chaos outside. His movements were economical but graceful, born from years of practice in a space barely large enough for one person to work efficiently. Every ingredient was measured carefully, not because he followed a recipe, but because he understood the value of each tomato, each handful of cilantro, each portion of meat. It was this attention to detail that first caught Victoria's attention. In her world, excess was a sign of success. Waste was acceptable because replacement was always possible. But here, in this 8 by 10 foot space, she witnessed a kind of efficiency that her MBA from Wharton had never taught her. Miguel's operation ran on principles that her business school professors would have dismissed as quaint. Customer loyalty built through genuine care, profit margins that prioritize sustainability over maximum extraction, and a business model that saw employees as family rather than expendable resources. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria began to notice details that had been invisible to her before. The way Miguel's face lit up when Mrs. Chun from the laundromat next door stopped by for her usual order, asking about his daughter's college applications. The patience he showed when young Jimmy, a kid from the neighborhood who clearly struggled with learning difficulties, counted out exact change for a tamale with careful concentration. The genuine concern in his voice when he asked about the health of customers' family members whose names he had somehow memorized, despite serving hundreds of people each week. These interactions revealed a richness of human connection that Victoria realized had been absent from her life for years. Her relationships were transactional business partnerships, strategic social connections, and staff members who were paid to anticipate her needs. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked about her well-being without an ulterior motive, or the last time she had genuinely cared about someone else's struggles. The revelation deepened as Victoria observed Miguel's phone conversations with his family. His wife called to check on his safety, having heard about the protests on the news. His daughter, a sophomore at Northwestern University, called to discuss her concerns about student loan debt and her dreams of becoming a social worker. His elderly mother called from Los Angeles, where she was recovering from surgery, and Miguel listened patiently as she recounted her day with the kind of attention Victoria had never given to anyone. Each conversation revealed layers of responsibility and care that Victoria had never associated with people in Miguel's economic position. She had always assumed that wealth was a prerequisite for complexity, that interesting lives and meaningful relationships were luxuries available only to those who could afford them. Yet here was a man whose emotional richness put her own life to shame. As evening approached, the protests began to subside. The sirens grew more distant, and the crowds gradually dispersed. Victoria knew that her absence would have been noticed. By now, meetings missed, appointments canceled, staff members frantically trying to account for her whereabouts. But for the first time in decades, she felt no urgency to return to the carefully orchestrated chaos of her regular life. Miguel offered her a bowl of pozole, the traditional Mexican soup that had been simmering throughout the day. Victoria had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants around the world, had private chefs prepare meals costing more than most people's weekly groceries, but she couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like comfort rather than obligation. As she ate, Miguel shared his story without prompting. He had come to Chicago 15 years ago, leaving behind a family farm in Michoacan that could no longer support his growing family. The transition had been brutal: language barriers, immigration paperwork, jobs that paid below minimum wage because he had no legal recourse. But he had persevered, eventually saving enough to buy the food truck and establish the small business that now supported not only his immediate family but also sent monthly remittances to relatives still struggling in Mexico. His dreams were modest by Victoria's standards, but profound in their humanity. He wanted his daughter to graduate from college without debt, to have opportunities that his own education had never provided. He hoped to bring his aging parents to Chicago to care for them in their final years as they had cared for him. He dreamed of expanding his business just enough to hire a few employees, to provide jobs for other immigrants who were walking the same difficult path he had traveled. These aspirations struck Victoria with unexpected force. Her own goals, acquiring more properties, increasing her net worth, maintaining her position in Chicago's social hierarchy, suddenly seemed hollow by comparison. She had achieved everything she had set out to accomplish, but in doing so, she had lost sight of why those achievements had mattered in the first place. As darkness fell over the alley, Miguel prepared to close his truck. The protest had cost him a day's worth of revenue, but he showed no resentment toward the demonstrators or the circumstances that had disrupted his routine. Instead, he spoke about understanding their frustration, about the growing divide between those who had opportunities and those who didn't, about the importance of remembering that everyone was fighting battles that others couldn't see. When Miguel finally offered to call Victoria a taxi, she realized that she didn't want to leave. The alley had become a sanctuary from a life that suddenly felt foreign and empty. But she also understood that her education was complete. She had learned lessons in the space of a single day that decades of success had failed to teach her. As she prepared to return to her world of privilege and power, Victoria made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. She would use her influence differently, would remember the faces and stories of people she had trained herself not to see. The protest that had seemed like such an inconvenience had actually been a gift, a chance to step outside the bubble of wealth and discover the humanity she had spent years ignoring. The taxi that arrived to take her home was just another vehicle, not the luxury cocoon she had once required. As Chicago's skyline came into view, Victoria Sterling understood that she was returning as a different person than the one who had left that morning. The question that remained was whether she would have the courage to live according to what she had learned, or whether the comfort of her old life would gradually erode the insights that had cost her everything she thought she knew about herself. Miguel watched the taxi disappear into the night, then turned back to finish cleaning his truck. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness had planted seeds of change that would grow into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. In a world that often seemed divided by insurmountable barriers, one afternoon in a forgotten alley had proven that understanding was still possible, and that sometimes the most profound transformations began with the smallest acts of human decency.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.